nobody wants to talk about it. But I think, in my personal opinion, now that I understand the worst parts of myself, it can also lead myself to look at my creativity as well, and what are the drivers behind that, you know? Because some of the best art is made by anger and rage. Look at music, right?
Welcome to Peace Unplugged, take 2. Let's see how we get on this time. You were telling me about your shadow work and about how you're still learning about it. And you mentioned to me that you were at rehab. I'm making a presumption here. I used to work before I retired this time last year. I worked 15 years in a drugs and alcohol community service. So if that's something on the lines of, I'm making a presumption. Would I be correct there?
Yeah, good assumption. Sometimes they're the royal road to disaster, but in this one, you've nailed that. Well done.
It's interesting. I worked 15 years in that field, and shadow work is not something that I came across until about 6 months ago. So it's something that hadn't entered some of the therapeutic work that we did. Is it a fairly new kind of project, would you say, or piece of therapy?
It depends what you mean. I would say that shadow work's now more in the public lexicon, if you will. So it's more in the collective vernacular. But you know, there's been lots of practitioners doing it for many years, and you know, but are they quite as predominant as your Freudian modalities or Freudian practitioners? Probably not. But if you do a little bit of dig down on the history, you'll kind of know why that is, right? And then I suppose, like, I was just, I was just going to say as well, is that drug and alcohol services, and a lot of them are built, I suppose, on the sort of principles of humanism and Carl Rogers, and then the sort of the offshoots of that in terms of the therapeutic practitioners are more kind of cognitive behavioral therapists rather than the drilled down kind of depth and psychoanalytic work of Jung as well. Yeah, there's a difference there, right?
Yeah, I'm well aware. Probably the sort of work I've done has probably been more in the Carl Rogers side of things. One of the things that I do is I'm a mindfulness practitioner, so I work from that sort of view, that humanistic kind of angle. But that's not to dismiss any of it. You know, I think that there's value in all sorts of different therapies that we come across.
Totally, I agree.
What would you say is the most sort of specifically really useful thing about shadow work in itself? Can you explain to me a little bit more also about, from your perspective, what it actually is?
Well, yeah, I would say it on a real sort of simple level. It's the identification of triggers and behavioral patterns and projections and dreams. And then I suppose it's all underpinned by what they would call in certain field as ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, or developmental experiences. I think that for me, that would be like 5 things for you to do work on that would lead into, I suppose, the portal of shadow work, if that makes sense.
Well, I do know about it. It sounds it sounds to me quite a scary thing to get your head round. I think if it was something that I was to engage in myself, I think there would be a certain, if I'm honest, a certain amount of reluctance to want to go down that rabbit hole, you know?
That's a perfectly, and I use this word carefully, a perfectly normal way to be, because it's the exploration of the very worst parts of us. So not only as an individual, but as a collective as well. It's our jealousy, it's our rage, it's our envy, resentment, it's our anxiety, it's our sadness, it's our cruelty. And how many people are going to like confess up to that on a podcast with Martin, for example, or in a group, or even one-to-one with a therapist? Like, again, these are conversations that I think are not served well in the current societal structure that we live in, right? It's nobody wants to talk about it. But I think, in my personal opinion, now that I understand the worst parts of myself, it can also lead myself to look at my creativity as well, and what are the drivers behind that, you know? because some of the best art is made by anger and rage. Look at music, right? Look at the kind of explosion of punk music and metal and, you know, death metal, all these kind of things. Now, I'm not saying they're directly attributed to Carl Jung's reading of the shadow, but my guess is they're an expression of that shadow, right? That's a good integration point.
Yeah, I'd really agree with that. I think some of the people, I mean, I'm a musician myself, but also, you know, sort of when it comes to writing stuff as well, I quite often found that when I'm in a perhaps not the best of mental state, that's usually where I've got more to say, or
Mm.
musically, you know, some things comes out more so in those areas. And I think if we look at the history of some of the great composers and some of the great musicians and writers and they've all got a part of themselves that was difficult, but out of that comes great joy for other people, which is kind of paradoxical, isn't it? But fascinating at the same time.
And that word paradoxical itself's a classic Jungianism, right? It's everything and it's nothing. It's sometimes intangible. It's the things that are kind of unconscious. It's the impulses, the things that we react to, and we don't even really know why we're reacting to them and why. And I think the big window for me is, as well as sort of understanding the worst parts of myself, it was also around the decoding or the reimagining the dreams. Because in that rehab space, and if I look at some of the difficult developmental years I had where I was, suppose, exposed to a lot of unnecessary trauma as well, like my dreams were a particularly difficult thing to navigate a lot of the times. And if I look at the reasons why I chose certain substances, because they medicated that sort of pain and that trauma that was really condensed in that kind of unconscious part of me. And I'm not trying to say that was all the reasons why I chose to use certain substances, because I do believe there's a level of individual responsibility as well. But I do think that, yeah, that piece of learning and understanding the dreams that I was having and why I chose to self-medicate them, I think that there was a huge part of the shadow self in me that needed to be padded out and brought to the surface, I feel.
I will often wonder sometimes because it's this self-medication thing. I think is something that I think pretty much we all do to a greater or lesser extent. And I sometimes I think it's subconscious or almost unconscious that will go to try and find something. It doesn't, you know, if it's has a long term negative effect, there's not what's seen because we're looking for immediate satisfaction, looking for to get rid of something straight away rather than having to go through the pain to work out what the long term answer is. I'm thinking about very much a lot of the work I did when I used to run groups. I used to use the metaphor of it's the difference between looking at a picture or watching a movie. The movies is a bigger dimension. So working through the movie dimension gives hundreds of times more insight to just what is a static picture. Does that kind of resonate with you?
Yeah, definitely. It's that sort of separation between kind of 2 dimension and 3 dimensions, right? And in that 3 dimension world, that's when it becomes tangible and more real for me, anyway. Again, that's coming from a really individual filter. I would say that I'm a more experiential learner generally, so I prefer to be thrown into the deep end of things. And you know, if you're plundered in the deep end, that's pretty 3 dimensional for me.
Right. So how long have you been doing this for now?
Well, I suppose it started off with surface level journaling, and that was coming out of the sort of last couple of weeks of community rehab. And then when I was in a supported housing unit over in northwest London. And I suppose the crashing reality was that I had to figure out who I was, where I was, and one thing about sort of in recovery circles and why a lot of people end up lapsing or relapsing again is that your whole identity is intertwined with your addiction because it's been in service of that for so long. So I'd spent 17 years in that frame of mind. Remove the substance, sit there behind your supported housing unit door for that first time, what you got left To be honest, I was a puddle man, Martin, just to be really frank about it. I had no I had no emotions. I hadn't felt anything for a long time. I didn't know what anger was. I didn't know what sadness was. I didn't know what happiness was. Because again, it was all intertwined with my drug of choice. And so journaling was huge for me. And I'll be honest, 99% of it was absolute hard drive dumping garbage. I've done it every day religiously, day after day after day after day. And then what I was able to do is I would do a review piece at the end of every week. And if you have a look at sort of classic shadow work journaling, I was already identifying the patterns, although I wasn't doing it in accordance to what a psychoanalytic practitioner would tell you to do. It was much more a natural thing. But again, this came from surface level look at the Red Book, doing a little bit of sort of internet research into who was this guy Carl Jung, what was he all about? Oh yeah, him and Freud were close at one time, and he was a real fan of Freud, and then they split apart again. So I was doing that little bit of sort of bio work on the left hand side, and then journaling religiously. And then the first thing that really hit me was I read an extract from Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And I started to journal my dreams, because that was the thing that I suppose that was really disturbing. Anybody that's been through quite acute withdrawals, and the bit afterwards, it's the insomnia, it's the lack of sleep. That's where I suppose you're sort of, yeah, that's where well, for me, that's where my mental health really suffered. And so what I would do is I'd wake up as soon as I was in a dream. I got quite adept at it. I'd wake myself up, because it's like, oh no, I don't want to see that image. And as soon as I woke up, I was starting to think to myself, what is it I don't want to see? And then I started to identify patterns in that. And then the patterns were always around the adverse childhood experience. So just to give you an example of what it was, up to a park, central Edinburgh. I'm maybe between 8 and 9 years old. In front of me is the image of a family member, black and white dress. It's pitch black. All I can see is car lights coming towards me, and I can see the image of the dress. I'm running towards it, and I'm shouting to the person, come back, like real loud, real loud. I would cut myself off from the dream and wake myself up. But I journal this, and then from there, that becomes a sort of fully fledged reflection, rather than just, like a tacit memory. And then once I got to that point, I was like, okay. And then I actually started to quite enjoy the fact that I was an insomniac, and I could only really switch off for like a couple of hours at a time. And every time I woke up, I would have this like developing reflection that then became actually me locking into a difficult traumatic event with that family member, who was in a real state of fear and alarm. And then from there, once I was able to kind of fully flesh that out, I could then get to the point to accept that it happened, speak to the family member about it, sort of think about like, well, what actually happened? What happened was this: you were running away from a domestic abuse perpetrator. I was running after you because I was trying to understand what it was, a little person. And then from there, okay, it didn't make me feel any better about it, but my rational brain could really understand why that dream was a consistent it was a consistent reminder of something. There's a really clear example where the journaling, the shadow work, the adverse childhood experience then became something in the spirit of healing, Martin.
I I really I really get that. I get dreams myself, and the idea of journaling stuff, I think is I always advocate for people that are trying to overcome some mental issues. Is writing stuff down is a great way of getting it out of your head and onto a bit of paper. Or like you say, sometimes it's just and untangling the mess of that sort of thing. I know for myself, when I was in some therapy about 15 years ago. You know those things where you suddenly get a breakthrough. I was talking about watching a little YouTube video that was on at the time. It was about this father who had a disabled son. This true story about I think it's an Australian guy, a disabled son, and he do these Ironman things like long swims and running marathons, and everywhere he went, he took his disabled son with him. And every time I watched it, it I used to get really emotional. I find myself crying watching it, and I can remember saying to the therapist at the time, "I don't know why I find this, like, so emotional, but it really touches me." And then she said, "You wish your dad was like that?" And he was like, bang! It's like a smash in the face. And, then it didn't, like you say, it didn't take away the pain, but what it did is it exposed what it is. It's a bit like, when your car breaks down and then lift up and when you actually discover what the, what's wrong with it, um, and whether it can be fixed or not, it's that it takes away the not knowing. It's the actually having the knowledge of what it is that becomes the relief.
Yeah, agreed.
It's fascinating stuff, though, isn't it? It's as we look into these things, and I also believe that I think we never stop learning about stuff about ourselves and about the world around us and about different events, which I think gives us a reason to carry on living and discovering.
Yeah, and for me, I've always been quite a creative person as well. So that journaling piece and sort of sketching things out and creating music and poetry and all these things, like that's like for me, that's the best part of the human experience, right? That's when you've got like full agency. That's when, like for me, that's what freedom really is, right? And that's what safe space is, when you're given the opportunity to relax and put yourself in a position where you can actually let go of it. Because in my life, like in my employment and stuff, you've got a face on for there, you've got a face on for your kids, you've got a face on for your family. Like, you're always putting a masquerade on. And for me, that space just to let it all out, and however it is you get that, whatever the medium is for you to get to that point, like that's the beauty of the human experience for me, Martin.
Yeah, yeah. So you find that actually there's this that ability to, because let's face it, we live in a very judgmental world, don't we? And but that sometimes you have to take that risk and actually that risk to actually be ourselves, be who we really are. And like you said, sometimes that takes some discovering as well. And it's like a peeling back an onion, isn't it? There's just you get deeper down into the layers, and sometimes you find some interesting, nice stuff, and then sometimes you find some stuff that's not quite so nice as well. But it's the issue here is about actually doing it rather than actually stopping and then being stuck.
Yeah, is it nice to actually journal or say in the middle of a group that I have the capacity to be cruel? Is that an easy thing to say, right? It's not. Like I've done
Mm.
some absolutely horrendous things to people that I love. I've lied to them, I've cheated, I've stolen, I could go on and on and on. I've done things in anger. I've been in fights before where I've hurt another person, right? I've willingly went out my way to inflict pain on somebody. I've been entirely resentful. I've looked at somebody and wanted what they have. And in the moment, if I had my way, I would take everything they had for myself, right? Like that isn't, that it's not easy thing to say, but like anything, once you start to be open and your authentic self in the purest sense, then you can actually say, well, is that resentment upon another? Is that a reflection on them? Or is that a reflection on something inside me that's twisted? There's a schism, there's a schema there that I really need to iron out. Otherwise, I'm going to end up in a really difficult position. I'm going to end up putting myself in a situation, high risk situation. I'm going to end up in prison. I'm going to end up, worst case scenario, I'm going to end up dead, Martin, right? And because that's what happens a lot of the time, that these uncontained rage or that uncontained jealousy and resentment and all these things, they manifest in some of the worst situations. And to be honest, Martin, if you zoom out a little bit, look at our collective shadow right now, what's happening in the world. You look around especially in the UK, right? A lot of these sort of nefarious actors right now that have come to the fore, that's based on division and polarity and and the hatred on the other, that's something again that's not being spoken about openly, like the drivers for that sort of socio-political climate, man. Which is probably worth a whole episode on its own.
I think you're right. Actually, I think it is something that needs examining in a very collective way. one of the things that you said earlier, I think these are a very, very important part of these sort of therapies is the realization of projection. How we as human beings often the things that we find difficult or the things we get angry about or upset about are actually part of us, part of our own personality that we don't like and try to reject. So the the unfortunate way of doing it is that it's projecting it onto another human being. That's that when we become aware of that and actually sort of kind of take ownership, it's that situation of like owning one's feelings and thoughts. There's the communication techniques of like if you're having an argument with somebody, is rather than saying it's with a partner, rather than sort of saying I hate it when you do this and I hate this and you're wrong and I'm right. You sort of say, well, you say another way of doing it is saying when you do that or say this, I feel. So you take ownership. We take ownership for our own feelings. It's then not accusatory. It's
No,
expressing ourselves authentically, isn't it?
for sure. And usually the hatred of the other actually comes from the source that there's a part of you that you hate and you're just projecting it on somebody else or a group of people or or a situation or whatever, right? But again, that's difficult work to do, and it's difficult to have that open conversation. I always look at it like sort of learning out in the open.
Yeah, yeah. I think the other thing about it is it's a great, I think, temptation to embrace that kind of that therapy work. If it's not in the right environment, it can be quite dangerous because there's other people
Very.
that are not. If you're on that therapy journey and somebody else isn't aligning with you or not even wanting to do that sort of thing or not needing to do that sort of thing, then actually we can end up getting attacked, possibly physically, very much more so, I think, emotionally.
Yeah. And sort of further sort of building block to that collective shadow, if you look at the UK and kind of what's going on now as well, our society is set up in a way as well that it's it's a profit based. Everything's attention economy based. Everything's quick. People are firing adverts at us, reels at us as well. So the whole design of the society is meant to keep us in our place. This is what you'll watch. This is how you'll watch it. It's fueled by I suppose the very worst sort of cases of kind of rampant addiction. If you look at people kind of doom scrolling on their phone or disappearing down YouTube rabbit holes as well. So in a certain way, the system is set up in a way to keep you medicated by however means necessary as well. So if you look at the conversations we're trying to have, Martin, about learning in the open and understanding yourself and the worst parts of yourself, when actually, if you zoom out a little bit, is that our current systems are set up in a way specifically for you not to have that conversation. Now, whether that's by design or not, well, again, there's a loophole directly into conspiracy, Martin, but I'm unwilling to go that far at this stage.
It makes it fascinating. I'm as guilty as the next person for doom scrolling and sitting and being addicted to mobile phone and just looking for stuff. And actually, that sometimes the times of actually sitting with ourselves in that discomfort is difficult. So it's all too easy to just play a game or
The algorithm will keep you coming back for more. I mean, the more it learns about you and the more that you click, the more it'll tailor the content just for you, Martin, right? How nice.
yeah, I am so guilty of it. And I think there's also a temptation. I think that very much the way my brain is wired, probably because I'm a little bit neurodivergent as well, is that it is almost like wanting some kind of perfection or expecting things to be perfect or
Mm.
expecting uh, a treatment to be perfect or the person giving that treatment to be perfect. And of course, none of us are perfect. One of the things I got out of the work I did and I continue to do to a large extent is if I'm talking to somebody about something, I'm actually talking to me because I'm the person that's listening as
Mm.
well. And actually, probably in many cases, I think I'm the most important person that's listening because so it's not about you don't do this because I don't do it because we all do. I like to use
Mm.
the we and the our rather than your because if you use the your, then it's almost like that can almost be accusatory, can't it? Almost becomes
Yeah.
them and us. If I said to you, Leon, If
It's
I said to you, Leon, okay, I talk to you about your dreams, actually, that actually collectively they might be different, but they're our dreams because we all dream.
Yeah, I understand. And what's interesting, what you mentioned there as well, that's something that I was taught a lot. I attended a Freudian Institute. This was like a couple of years after I finished rehab, and I was really sort of gathering pace in terms of knowledge and continuing on the kind of journaling and the shadow work piece. And anyway, just to give me something to do, I was like, okay, let me go and study some psychodynamics, as you do, right, on a Tuesday morning. So yeah, I actually attended a Freudian Institute, and what the one thing that they taught me was that working in triads piece, and how essentially that when you're having a one-to-one with somebody, you should have a third eye in terms of watching yourself, in terms of how you're listening, like what's your body language like, what's your frame like, what's your transference like as well, like when you're asking questions, why are you asking them, what's the motivations to asking questions, and then when you're in receipt of somebody's response, like how is your frame set up in a way? Is it set up in a way to bounce back the disclosure back to somebody? Or is it set up in a way for you to accept that, listen, consume, and then respond as well? So, yeah, what you're talking about reminds me of that sort of Freudian lens that was hammered home to us when I was doing my psychodynamic counseling.
Yeah, I always used to enjoy the triad work. I always found that really,
Mm.
really interesting. That ability to be able to step out, to be able to, as the observer, to step outside of the emotion, or at least the attempt to step outside of the emotion of what's going on in a interaction between two people, and observe it in the third party rather than, because that's difficult to do if we're doing a one to one because we're involved.
Yeah. But essentially, what it's teaching you, though, Martin, is essentially you become your own observer within the one-to-one relationship. But they never told me that at the time, right? I figured that out after the fact.
Right. Okay. So what is it you do now, Leon? What drives you in your world?
So there's a couple of things that I'm up to at the minute. So the first notable one is I've worked for a long time in a helping capacity, which probably no surprise to anybody listening in. So I've worked in a street outreach setting. So I was kind of coordinating for a good while. And then the pandemic happened. And so I was kind of doing the street outreach work, and then I set up emergency hotels in East London as well. So there was a kind of dual role thing going on there. Then I worked after the pandemic. I was going to say went away. It never really went away, right? Let's park the pandemic bit at the end. Yeah. Then I moved into working in high impact accommodations and worked in a domestic abuse refuge for males, which was a really eye opening experience, especially for somebody like me who's a kind of white cis traditionalist, and moving into that environment, that the learning curve was real steep there. So yeah, I pretty much working still in a helping capacity, but now I suppose I sit in a more strategic position, yeah, which is, yeah, I do miss the client work occasionally as well, but I'm sort of impacting change just from a more sort of wider lens. And then on the left hand side, I also do some contributing writing for a little magazine called The Pavement. So yeah, we speak about all kinds of topics that happens for people who are experiencing homelessness. And then I've got my own podcast as well, which is 12 episodes deep now, and sort of drilling back to the point we're here on shadow work. It's called Too Light, Too Dark, which is, I suppose, a reflection of that sort of tension between both polarities, and usually a lot of the answers sort of fall in between these two points as well. So heavily influenced by Jung, and yes, speaking to all types of practitioners from all over the world, and bringing sort of thought leaders into our space, and really exploring some of these difficult topics that we've discussed earlier, Martin.
Fantastic. I think it's one of the things I found is the podcasting for me has been it's, I think, sort of actually being outside of employment now. I don't think I'll ever go back into employment ever again, because there's some real difficulties with it, that I experienced. And so now it's like having the freedom to be able to explore what I want to do, is doing that very much from an authentic self. So when I was when I was working for one of the organizations. And in fact, it was actually over 3 organizations when you think in terms of, how that sort of work gets recommissioned. There was always that kind of, the protocols that we have to follow, and how sometimes that for some people they're taken too literally. I think one of the biggest lessons for myself I learned was when I came into that sort of work 15 years ago. I thought, oh, right, okay, I'm going into this kind of helping profession, if you like, wanting to help other people. And there's going to be lots of lovely people to work around because they're all very, very caring, and they're very, very caring about their clients. And then I discovered to my shock that actually some of the people I worked with were some of the nastiest people I'd ever come across in my life. Again, it's like a paradox. It's like, how on earth did that happen? I've worked in commercial areas before, and difficulties, but then coming across people that were worse than that, just really I couldn't fathom it. But I worked through it, coming out the other side of it now. I feel like it's right. Okay, I've just done written a piece on policies and procedures and how they can be
Mm,
interpreted, and how they can actually be used as a weapon sometimes to punish somebody. So people will stand behind those, and they're not kind of using them authentically. It's just okay. Well, it says in here that you know we must that you must do this or I must do that, and then finding out it's that it can be derogatory to people. I think one of the things that I'm pleased to be away from was managing methadone scripts, and
mm,
or Suboxone scripts, or Subutex scripts, and all the kind of there was a degree of control involved with that, which we know is needed, but it would be interpreted by different people for different reasons. And I think it would attract people who love being in control of somebody. You can't, a client would come along and say, well, I need to go and visit, I need to go and visit my brother the other end of the country tomorrow.
mm,
Okay, well, you've got to produce this, that, and have all these bits of evidence and ask permission to be able to go somewhere. And I understand the reasons for that, but it wasn't the issue was not the reasons for it. The issue was the way it was dealt, the way it was sometimes the inhumane way that was put over, and the fear-based side of it, of the fear of the practitioner. Oh, crikey, if I don't do this, then I'm going to be in trouble. Something happens to that person. And so I struggled an awful lot with that in that work. I don't know whether that's something that you've witnessed or come across. If you've done a lot of work with people on the street, I should imagine that you would have come across that quite frequently.
yeah, I've got a couple of trains of thought on that. So suppose thought train one would be that I've been on the sharp end of that as well. So for the longest time, I was on 70 mil every day. And really, at some point when I suppose my problematic drug use was starting to accelerate as well, it got to the point where I didn't have access to my kids anymore. Relationship had broken down and I was homeless. And then what I had to go through was I had to go through a load of these kind of special intervention points where my hair was snipped and tested, where I was sat in a room full of practitioners who were making judgment calls. And I'll never forget this, Martin, right? One person actually wrote that basically that my capacity for change was deemed as grim. So I was written off fundamentally in terms of ever being able to get back on my feet again. And never once was there a treatment option ever offered to me that wasn't come and pick up your scripts. That'll keep you stable. But if you ever want to see your kids again, the chances of that are grim because, you're under the influence, you're this, you're that. And a lot of judgment calls were made around me. And I do think on a certain level, I think methadone's good as a sort of early stage stabilizer, but I do think there is a kind of health responsibility to not park people on these scripts for years on end as well. So I do have a kind of individual take on that. And then I suppose looking at it when working with other people who were trying to navigate these systems and navigate, I suppose, treatment systems as well, is that if I think about the pandemic specifically, used to have to wait weeks and weeks for a methadone script. All of a sudden, in the middle of a public health emergency, that was stripped down to literally days, Martin. So again, I'm not saying that that there's gatekeepers that hold on to control, But if you look at that through the microcosm, COVID-19, all of a sudden treatment was possible, like ending homelessness was possible, like all sorts of things are actually possible when you get statutory services speaking to each other, Martin.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'd absolutely agree. And the COVID-19 experience for me was very significant because I nearly lost my life through it. And it gave me a whole different perspective of working life, finding out who you thought were your friends and discovering they weren't after all. So that again, that was like a major learning thing for me was to go through that experience. I can remember sort of lying in the bed thinking it's all over. I'm going to go, and actually sort of begging to stay alive, um, and then actually finally getting through in that, and almost like coming out on the other side of a parallel universe of like, right, the world's not quite what I thought it was. Everything's different. I still have that thought today, that like kind of conspiracy theory thought is actually, have I just come down the other side of into a parallel universe somewhere where everything's different? It's fascinating, isn't it?
Mm-hmm, for sure. And a near-death experience will do that to you. I think what was interesting myself, I had a couple of them during my 17 years of absolute sort of write-off, and I had a couple of them at the time, but it's really interesting with certain drugs, right? Even you can medicate your own bloody expiry date, Martin. You make an inference there towards you're begging for your own life, right? And yeah, I've had that a couple of times, and I've had to ponder, like, well, like, and I don't want to get like religious or too spiritual here, but it's touching upon the kind of the Jungian points and the shadow itself. It's funny when a human being's faced with the expiry, all of a sudden we're begging something or someone or ourselves to get us through to the next point as well, right? And yeah, it'll do that to you, right? That's my point.
The whole spiritual side of it. I've always say I don't like using the word religious because it's got far too many things that it means different things to different people. But I do associate with the spiritual, that there's something basic senses that we have that's a little bit hidden or not obvious, and that kind of makes things interesting. I mean, that sense of being almost like that point of where I thought I was going to lose my life, and actually saying, and waiting to come down on one side or the other and not knowing what the answer was, and experiencing. And I don't know whether it was I could explain it away as probably because of the medication I was on at the time, the experimental remdesivir they put me on. I agreed to take it because I'm lying in this bed watching loads of people die around me, and so I thought I'll try anything. But I had some really,
Of
really
course.
weird experiences, probably hallucinatory to a point. But was it the medication, or was it actually that near death experience, or maybe a combination of the two? Sure, which really, I look back on it now, very scary at the time. Now that's just interesting how that. And if we're talking about shadow work those things, I think they're still linked. I think it's very much a part of how we move through life, how we grow. I think grow spiritually, grow in our minds and our thoughts and our intellect. These things are sent along to discover something new, like an expanding universe.
And Jung said it himself, like in that dream space or in that unconscious space, you have the ability to see around corners, which is a really interesting take, right? And I think sort of dialing back to sort of my opening words as well, that was always something I was super fascinated around as well, in terms of that ability. And I suppose some people are scared of the unknown, and I'm not saying I walk towards fear with absolute gay abandon. I'm not saying that, but I do love that feeling of being super anxious and literally running towards it and kicking through it just to see what's on the other side. And I suppose that's what got me in trouble with substances in the first place, right? Is that bit. And obviously I've learned how to channel that now. And that's a byproduct of shadow work now, right? Is that I know what my internal drives. I know the beast in myself now, and it's taken me many years to be able to sort of contain him and then learn when to push the button where I can let him out a little bit, right? But I know he's always there. He's always like tapping me on the shoulder, right? It's interesting. And if you look at that through a mental health filter, yeah, I've seen a lot of other people who maybe their beast is untamed and they can't keep a lid on it. And especially look at my time working in psychiatric care, is that I think me and a lot of the patients who I worked with, that was the one commonality we had, is that there was a recognition of that beast. But the only difference between me and them and myself was I maybe had this much control in it comparatively to them not having the skills to control.
Yeah. Okay, Leon. So just talking to sort of trying to summarize kind of the discussion we've had today, and what would you be saying to people that will be watching this and listening to this when it gets broadcast? What sort of pearls of wisdom would you like to share with people? And also, I also give you the opportunity to shamelessly promote what you do with your own podcast as well. So two aspects there.
Nice. I would say that if you are going to engage in shadow work, it's probably safer to do that within a therapeutic relationship if you're brand new to it. Yeah, I think safety in this field is paramount. And you'll know that yourself, Martin, having worked in various clinical settings as well. Make sure that what you're doing is safe and you have a support network to discuss shadow work as you go through the different iterations of it. I'll dial back to that sort of that first five is the triggers, it's the patterns, it's the projections, it's the dreams, and it's the developmental years. It's a combination of that. That would be my sort of start off points, but just make sure that you do that in a safe environment as possible. Because ultimately, this is coming from a place of love and discovery and healing from my side. Yeah, for me, in terms of our podcast, really it's to bring the brightest and best people that we can attract on our podcast to explore the human experience in all its forms. That would be the best way I could describe it. Yeah, we've had all sorts of people. Like, for example, we had a 9/11 first responder, and understanding the trauma work that they had to do following that event and what that looked like. We've had Tavistock clinicians who are sort of, I suppose, the brightest and best therapeutic practitioners in this country, coming from that classic sort of Wilfred Bion and group work model, and trying to understand sort of masculinity and the vulnerability behind that. So we've had all types of flavors of guests on that are in service of trying to put out a message of healing and hope. You can find us on Apple and Spotify. It's at Too Light Too Dark, easy to find. And then we're on Instagram as well, at Too Light Too Dark. YouTube, guess what? At Too Light Too Dark. So just type that in a search engine. You'll be able to find us. And suppose from my side to close, Martin, thank you for inviting me. It's been a very interesting conversation where we've tackled all sorts of things. So I just thank you for your time and for the space that you've created as well, Martin.
Thank you, Leon. Thanks for being part of this, and I'm wishing you well. One final question, and I haven't asked this one for a little while, and it's one of the favorite ones I like to ask
Go on.
is, can I ask you, Leon, what brings you peace?
What brings me peace? Wow. Suppose a nice meal, the right song, right lighting, and I suppose knowing that the people that I love the most are around me and have some sort of sanctity. So there's a little bit of individual there and a little bit about the people that want me to succeed and drive me on. That's a reciprocal act as well. So.
That's brilliant.